Brittany Maynard was born and raised in Anaheim, California. She graduated from the University of California with a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in education. She was married to her husband Daniel, and they're ready to start a family. But on January 1st, 2014, she was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer and was only given 6 months left to live. This news was quite shocking to both her and her husband because they had hopes for a better future together. They also found out later on that the disease would cause her mind to degenerate, losing all sense of herself. So she could preserve her dignity, she chose to actively euthanize herself on November that same year. The question remains is, did Brittany make the right choice? Each year, over 1 million people are diagnosed with cancer, and only about half of them end up living. People diagnosed with a terminal illness want to seek relief from their pain and their suffering, and voluntary active euthanasia is a potential solution. But is it a morally permissible one? Is it an act of suicide or a death with dignity? That will be for you to decide. In this speech, I will discuss two arguments that confirm and deny the moral permissibility of voluntary active euthanasia. I will first present James Rachel's argument in support of voluntary active euthanasia, and I will then end with Daniel Callahan's argument against it. James Rachel argues that there's no moral difference between killing somebody and allowing them to die. And if this is true, there's no difference between voluntary active euthanasia and passive euthanasia, which would make the former permissible. Daniel Callahan, however, argues that voluntary active euthanasia is the equivalent of committing suicide, and that the legalization of such an action would have serious social implications in our society. I'm going to go ahead and present James Rachel's argument in support of voluntary active euthanasia, and you can decide whether to accept his moral reasoning. According to James Rachel, voluntary active euthanasia is morally permissible. Now, if we take a look at the American Medical Association's policy, they claim that passive euthanasia is morally permissible while voluntary active euthanasia is not. Now, if we take a look at the purpose of the medical profession, their purpose is to promote, sustain, and preserve life. So for them to allow the intentional but merciful killing of another person, that would disrupt the entire foundation in which the medical world is built upon. We know that in some cases, patients are diagnosed and are terminally ill, that there's no hope for their survival. So they can have the choice to withhold their treatment and allow themselves to die through natural causes. This is also known as passive euthanasia. Now, according to the AMA, active euthanasia is the intentional killing of another person. And James Rachel claims that there's cases where active euthanasia would be preferable to passive euthanasia. Let me give the following example. Let's say we have a patient that's diagnosed with cancer. They're in immense pain and suffering, and there's no hope for their survival. So since they want their suffering to end, they choose that they want themselves to die. And since we have the AMA's policy, it only allows them to choose passive euthanasia, which we know only allows them to die through natural causes, in this case cancer. And we know the process of death is not necessarily quick. So in the process of dying, they're still suffering. In this case, active euthanasia would be preferable because it would allow their suffering to end immediately. So if we take a harder look at passive euthanasia, we can kind of see it's a contradiction in itself, because the purpose of passive euthanasia is to alleviate and end suffering, but it inadvertently prolongs the suffering because it prolongs the process of dying. So to say that active euthanasia is morally impermissible would be to say that this cancer patient, that it's okay for them to needlessly suffer until they die. So we can see that there's some flawed moral reasoning when regarding passive and active euthanasia and the AMA's policy against it. Now, if we're going along with flawed reasoning, when we take a look at the AMA's policy regarding life and death, we can see that there's further flaws in it. Let's going back to their original policy. We know that allowing a patient to die is okay, but intentionally killing a patient is not okay. So in some cases, parents will have a child, and sometimes this child might have Down syndrome. And there's some parents that don't want to have a Down syndrome baby. but the AMA cannot condone killing a Down syndrome baby because Down syndrome is not a terminal illness, which would allow the baby to die through natural causes. So the AMA kind of found a loophole for parents to allow them to kill the child. In some cases, Down syndrome babies will be born with a physical abnormality, and if left untreated, will allow the baby to die through natural causes. And so the power is given back to the parents to decide whether they want their child to live or die. The AMA understands the actual moral reasoning behind the parents wanting their child to die, but they can't condone that type of reasoning. So they create this sort of false and illusory moral reasoning, which allows them to satisfy the needs of the parents and satisfy the moral reasoning of their policy. So if we take a look at the AMA's policy, it's somewhat questionable and suspicious. And if this policy is questionable and suspicious, it's reasonable to say that they have other policies that are subject to the same problem. So it could be concluded that the moral reasoning behind passive and active euthanasia should be reevaluated altogether. The American Medical Association claims that there's a moral difference between allowing somebody to die and intentionally killing them. James Rachel, however, argues the contrary, stating that allowing somebody to die and killing them are morally equivalent. And he gives the following example to illustrate this point. Imagine, if you will, that we have two people, one named Smith, one named Jones, and they both want to kill their nephew so they can gain his inheritance. And Smith goes in with the intentions to drown his nephew in a bathtub. And he does exactly that and gains his inheritance. Now Jones, he goes in with the exact same intentions, but his nephew slips, knocks himself unconscious, and is face down in the water. He's beginning to drown, and Jones allows him to drown, and he dies, and he gains his inheritance. Now, if we take a look at both of these examples, we can see that they're the exact same situation. The only difference being is that Smith intentionally killed his nephew, while Jones allowed his nephew to die. We can clearly see that both these actions are reprehensible. And to say that there's a moral difference between the two actions, that'd be the same thing as saying is that Jones is a morally better person than Smith is. And this is not so. They're both equally wrong. And since they're both equally wrong, there's no moral difference in their actions. Therefore, we can conclude that allowing somebody to die and intentionally killing somebody are morally equivalent, since they both result in death. Now, the American Medical Association also claims that active and passive euthanasia are distinctly different. The reason being is that passive euthanasia, the doctor does nothing, allowing the patient to die, and with active euthanasia, the doctor does do something, namely killing the patient. But isn't the act of not doing something still an action? The AMA doesn't believe that. They believe that since the doctor is not doing anything, he's not intentionally killing the patient. And James Rachel gives another example to counter this point. Let's say we have a doctor who has a curable patient, and the doctor decides to withhold treatment, and the patient ends up dying. We can first see that the doctor's actions are morally reprehensible, and he shouldn't have done that. And two, if the doctor was prosecuted in a court of law, his action of not doing anything, of allowing the patient to die by withholding treatment, would be the same thing as if he intentionally killed the patient. So we can learn from this example that the action of omission, the act of not doing anything, is still an action. And what we can also derive from this example is that active and passive euthanasia are the same thing. They both result in the intentional killing of another person. And if we take a look back at all the arguments that James Rachel has given, we can see that active euthanasia is no worse than passive euthanasia and should be considered a morally permissible action. I'm going to go ahead and now present Daniel Callahan's argument against voluntary active euthanasia, and you can decide if his moral reasoning is sound. Daniel Callahan argues that voluntary active euthanasia is morally impermissible, and that is just another form of suicide. But before I get to the main argument, I would like to take a closer look at suicide. Suicide is viewed as something morally problematic in our society. People tend to have natural feelings that it's wrong. And in several different cultures and societies, it has been tradition for several centuries that suicide is wrong. Let's say we have a person that is going through a tough time. Either they went through divorce, a loss of employment, or the death of a family member. For them to commit an act of suicide so their suffering can end will be seen as a very irrational way to deal with their problems. We also have to note that human life is very valuable. It's something considered very precious. And it's better for someone that's having a problem to bear it and overcome it than for them to end their suffering through an act of suicide. Now, even with all these views for suicide, we still have people that support a voluntary act of euthanasia, which Daniel Callahan sees as an act of suicide. And here are the following arguments that support it. First being is people believe that they have a right to control their body and that they know what's best for it. And that right is further extended to the right to end their own life when they see fit. Second is, when you see somebody suffering, it's natural that you want to alleviate their suffering. And for these people, they view that voluntary act of euthanasia as a potential way to end their suffering, even though it's a permanent way of doing it. And lastly, people don't see a distinct difference between ending the treatment of a dying patient and killing a patient through active euthanasia. Since doctors are allowed to do the former, they should be allowed to do the latter too. Now, Daniel Callahan sees several flaws within these arguments, and he gives the following objections. Here's the first objection to the first argument, is that people who believe that they have a right to control their own body view it as a private and an individual matter, and this isn't so, since it requires the assistance of a third party, namely a doctor or a physician. Now, if we were to legalize such an action, it would give the doctors the power to kill. Now, this would disrupt the entire medical profession because their very purpose is to preserve, promote, and save lives. Also, there would be no way to place the checks and balances upon this system, since doctors have a patient and doctor confidentiality. Now, in response to the second argument, there are alternative ways to alleviate another person's suffering that doesn't result in death. We have good palliative care. Modern medicine has advanced to a great point where people's suffering can be reduced dramatically. Also, if we think about it, to end another person's suffering, it's not an absolute duty that trumps all other moral objections. Let's say I have a person that's suffering, and in order for me to end their suffering, I have to end another person's life. I'm not going to do that because that person's right to life is more important than the right for that person to have their suffering end. Now, in response to the third argument, we have to remember that with a terminally ill patient, that they can't be saved in the long run. Doctors don't have godlike powers where they can control life and death. There's only so much that they can do to save and preserve the life of a patient. So when we have a patient that's dying in the long run and there's nothing more that the doctors can do, they cease medical care, and in the end, the disease kills the patient, not the doctor. But even with all these objections that Daniel Callahan has given, let's disregard all those. And let's say we did legalize voluntary active euthanasia within our society. What would happen? Well, let's take a look at the Dutch courts because they did legalize it within their society. And they put a lot of restrictions on it so it wouldn't be abused. But even with all these restrictions, violations still took place within their society. Within 1 year, over 1,000 cases of non-voluntary active euthanasia took place. And out of all the cases where voluntary active euthanasia did take place, half of them weren't even reported. Now we can see that there's no correct way to monitor the rightful administration of voluntary active euthanasia. And even with all the restrictions, you're always going to have people who are going to abuse and take advantage of the law. Now let's take a look at a different society. In the state of Oregon, they also legalized voluntary active euthanasia. But even with the legalization of this policy, a very small percentage of the population actually took advantage of it. And that small percentage that did take advantage of it, they didn't do it to have their suffering alleviated or their pain ended. They did it because they were afraid of losing their autonomy. And this was due to the nature of their disease or their sickness that they had. Now, we're not going to make a huge radical change in a moral law, which would have serious social and moral complications within our society, in favor of such a small minority that's afraid of losing their autonomy. So right now we have seen several arguments that are in support and against a voluntary active euthanasia. Now we have to decide who is right. The moral permissibility of voluntary active euthanasia can be quite difficult to determine. James Rachel argues that there is no difference between allowing somebody to die and killing them, that they're both morally equivalent. And since they are both morally equivalent, active euthanasia is no worse than passive euthanasia and should be accepted as such. Daniel Callahan, however, argues that voluntary active euthanasia is just another form of suicide. Several popular arguments and statements are given in favor of voluntary active euthanasia, but should be dismissed since they are flawed, especially since they cater to such a small minority. And even with these two arguments, there's several additional arguments that are in favor of and against voluntary active euthanasia that haven't even been given. But the question still remains, is what argument will you stand behind in the end?